Mail-order bride was rejected for being already pregnant, until one man became her child savior. The train sighed its last breath, like an old mule giving up on the road. Steam rose in soft ghosts around the iron wheels as the prairie wind met it with a hush. Clara stepped down, one gloved hand on the rail, the other cradling the weight of the life growing beneath her ribs. The station was barely more than a sign and a bench, no depot, no porter. Just dirt and sky. And silence. She wore her best dress, faded blue with mended seams. A hat pinned to her hair, with trembling care. She'd practiced her smile in the reflection of a train window, softened the worry in her brow with her fingers. But here, under the yawning western sun, there was nothing between her and the truth of things. She was alone, and showing. A letter had brought her this far. Folded neat, sealed with a name she didn't know and a promise she half believed. Emery Tate, 37, owns cattle and land, seeking a woman of strong constitution and simple beauty for marriage and domestic companionship. No mention of children, no mention of exceptions. She'd mailed her reply without confessing. Couldn't bring herself to write I am already carrying a child, and he has no father worth naming. What was the use? The world never made space for girls like her, used, abandoned, too full of memory and consequence. Still, she'd stepped aboard that train with hope pinned under her ribs like a second heart. Emery arrived in a creaking buggy drawn by a dusty roan. He pulled the brim of his hat low when he saw her. Didn't wave. Didn't smile. Just stared for a breath too long, his jaw hardening like cooling iron. "You Clara Jennings?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, sir." He stepped down, boots crunching gravel. His eyes, gray like river stone, flicked once to her face, then her midsection. He exhaled, and that was the whole sermon. "You didn't say you were expectant." Clara swallowed. I didn't lie. It didn't seem like something a letter could explain." "Well," he said, voice dry as fence posts. "It explains enough." He turned back toward the buggy. No offer to take her bag. No gesture toward the seat beside him. Just silence. "I came all this way," she said softly, dust already on her hem. "I didn't ask you to." And he climbed back onto the bench, flicking the reins before she could answer. The buggy wheels turned without her. She stood there, the letter still in her hand like a wilted flower. The wind lifted her skirt gently, as if trying to cover her shame. No one else stood on the platform. The train groaned behind her, preparing to leave again. She didn't turn. She couldn't. A hot prickle rose behind her eyes, but she blinked hard and looked instead to the far hills, where the land folded like a sleeping animal. The town itself wasn't much, two dusty streets crossing like old scars, framed by plank front doors and cracked glass windows. She walked with her head high, though every step felt heavier. Children watched her from a porch. A shopkeeper paused mid-sweep. Eyes trailed her belly. A woman muttered beneath her breath. There was no room at the inn, not because they were full, but because the innkeeper's wife took one look and said she didn't want trouble. Not from her. Not from her kind. She found a bench under the shade of a cottonwood near the church, sat down with her hands folded and back straight, like a schoolgirl waiting to be called inside. The sun moved behind the steeple. Time passed slowly, like molasses running uphill. Her baby shifted within her, as if restless for something better than this. That's when the porch door creaked open across the street. An older woman stepped out, gray hair pulled back in a bun that looked like it had survived wars. She wore a gingham apron and held a pitcher of water. No words, no fuss. Just set it down beside Clara and returned inside. Clara sipped it slowly. It was cool and clean. The kind of kindness that didn't ask questions. The light faded. Crickets began to sing. The church bell rang once, just to remind the world it still stood. Clara rested her hand over the swell of her child, tracing small circles where a foot had kicked. No one had asked her its name. No one knew. Not even her. She'd saved naming for a safer place, a softer season. She stayed on that bench until the sky turned violet. There were stars coming out, shy and scattered, when the widow returned with a pillow and a blanket. "You can sleep here tonight," the woman said without looking at her directly. I got no room inside, but you'll be dry. Ain't supposed to rain. Clara nodded. Thank you, ma'am. The woman shrugged. Wasn't for you. It's for the little one. Looks like she didn't ask for any of this either. Clara smiled then, tired and real. It hurt a little to do so. The night wrapped around her like a quilt too thin for the cold. She laid down slowly, her back stiff from weeks of travel, her body aching in places she didn't know had names. The pillow smelled like lavender. Somewhere far off, an owl called into the dark. She didn't sleep right away. She stared at the stars, waiting for some kind of sign, some whisper of purpose in all this silence. But the sky said nothing, just blinked down at her with its 1,000 quiet eyes. Still, she was not as alone as she'd been yesterday. That was something. She thought about the letter again, about the way ink had carried hope across so many miles. She thought about Emery Tate and the way a man's pride can shrink his kindness. She thought about the child inside her, small, brave, undeserving of this world's meanness. Tomorrow would come. She didn't know what it would hold, only that it would ask her to rise. And she would, because she had not come all this way to vanish. And somewhere, she believed, perhaps foolishly, perhaps faithfully, that someone might still see her not as a burden, but as a beginning. The morning came in soft brushstrokes, pink and gray bleeding through the sky. Clara sat upright on the porch bench, the pillow creased beneath her spine, the blanket tucked neatly at her side. Her back ached from the stiffness of the night, and her feet were swollen in her boots. But the silence of the hour held her like cupped hands. For a moment, before the town stirred, there was peace. She heard it before she saw it, the thud of an axe splitting wood. Steady, methodical. Not angry, not rushed, just the clean rhythm of labor. Across the dirt lane, behind the widow's house, smoke trailed from a crooked chimney. She hadn't noticed the second cabin before, set deeper in the trees, half swallowed by cottonwoods and hush. It looked older, built by hand in weather, the kind of place that didn't need announcing. The axe rang again. She turned her head and saw him. He stood with his back to her, tall and broad-shouldered, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, hair dark as riverbed rock. His movements carried a quiet grace, no wasted effort, no show. Just work, done for its own sake. When he paused, it was to lean and gather the logs, stacking them in thoughtful rows. The sort of man who noticed how things leaned. She didn't call out, didn't wave. She only watched, unsure if stillness might be her best protection. Later, the widow brought her bread and a boiled egg, wrapped in cloth. Said little, just nodded toward the cabin. He's got a place out back, she muttered. Doesn't use it much. You could. Clara blinked. You mean the woodshed? The woman squinted at her. I mean the guest loft. Was his daughter's once. Before. Before what? She didn't ask. He doesn't speak much, the woman went on, but he listens better than most. Name's Elias Morrow. He won't bother you none. Clara hesitated. And the church folk. They'd rather talk about who took you and then why no one else did. There wasn't much to gather. Her single bag, the blanket, the hope she hadn't quite killed. She walked the narrow path behind the widow's house, shoes crunching gravel, the wind brushing past like it knew she didn't belong but wouldn't stop her. The cabin waited, still and unassuming. A rocker on the porch, a broom leaned by the door. The smell of cedar and something sweet in the air. Honey, maybe. He was splitting kindling now, his brow damp, jaw set in calm focus. When he saw her, he didn't flinch or frown, just leaned the axe against the chopping block and wiped his hands on a rag. I was told there's a loft, she said, voice low. He nodded once, then walked past her, up the porch steps, and opened the door. Inside, the cabin was clean in a way that felt lived in, not staged. Shelves with jars, herbs, pickles, dried beans. A table worn smooth at the corners. A carved figurine of a horse tucked in a windowsill. He pointed to the ladder. It's warmest up there, he said. His voice was deep but not rough. Measured, like a man who'd practiced, saying only what mattered. She climbed the ladder slowly, one hand steadying her belly. The loft was small but soft, quilt folded on a cot, glass-pane window overlooking the trees. A bowl of dried lavender sat on a crate beside the bed. She turned to look down at him. "I'll be out of your way. You're not in it." And with that, he disappeared outside again, closing the door behind him. She slept for hours, deeper than she had in weeks. When she woke, the sun had moved across the sky, casting gold through the rafters. She heard the bees first, gentle buzzing beyond the open window. She leaned out and saw them working a row of hives tucked between the trees, painted white, buzzing like a lullaby. Later, she joined him in the yard, not because he asked, because the silence between them didn't feel dangerous. It felt wide enough for breathing. "I used to help my mother keep bees," she said, watching one land on a purple bloom. "She said they teach you patience." She was right. That was all. He didn't ask about her mother, or the baby, or the train, or the man who'd left her standing on the platform. He didn't ask anything. But the next day, she found a second stool beside the hives. The kind gesture of someone who knew watching was also a kind of work. Days passed like that, unspoken arrangements, small tasks. She swept the loft, cooked simple meals. He tended the hives and carved at night, shaping wood into animals and bowls. He left his work on the porch, and she began painting them with what little she had. A scrap of blue here, a soft gold there. It was quiet collaboration, and that quiet became a language. Children came sometimes, lingering near the trees. One boy in particular, about 12, with a quick mouth and a lean hunger in his eyes. "That's Ben," Elias said one morning. "Scavenges mostly. Lost both parents last winter." Clara offered the boy a heel of bread. He took it without words, but nodded once in thanks. The next day, he brought her a button. "From a soldier's coat," he said. "For luck." She kept it in the pocket of her dress. That evening, Elias handed her a jar of honey. "For the child," he said. Clara held it like a gift made of light. "You don't have to feed me," she murmured. "I'm not," he replied. "I'm feeding you both." The moon was high that night when she sat outside the cabin alone, shawl around her shoulders. The bees were quiet, the trees murmuring in the wind. She thought about the letter, the rejection, the shame, all the doors that had closed. But here, without explanation, without negotiation, a door had opened. No questions, no cost, just a space to rest. She whispered a name into the dark. Not the baby's name, not yet, but a name for herself. A version of Clara that didn't flinch, didn't beg. The one who had come all this way not to find a husband, but a home. The door creaked open behind her. Elias stepped out, carrying a blanket. "You'll catch cold," he said, setting it gently over her shoulders. She turned her face toward him. "Why are you being kind to me?" He was quiet for a while, the kind of silence that had shape, because someone ought to be. He went back inside without another word. Clara looked down at her hands, then at the trees, then up at the stars. Something in her heart shifted, like a beam settling into place. Not safe yet, but steadier. Tomorrow would come, and she would rise again, not as a burden, but maybe, just maybe, as someone becoming whole. Spring arrived quietly, as if unsure it was welcome. It crept into the hollows of trees and spilled down the hills in pale green whispers. Snowmelt carved soft fingers into the earth, and bees stretched their wings in the warmer air. The world around the cabin began to breathe in color again, and so did Clara. She moved slower now, the weight of her belly pulling her forward like a tide. Yet her hands had grown steady, her mind clearer. Each morning, she stepped into the light, bare feet pressed into thawed ground, fingers digging into the dirt just beneath the porch where nothing had yet dared to grow. At first, it was just to pass the time. She tilled with a spoon, pulled stones, scattered seeds she'd found in a forgotten box near Elias's shed. She didn't know what they were, only that they were something waiting to be more. Elias noticed but said nothing. He passed by each day with a small nod, setting tools by the porch, a crate of glass jars, sometimes bread wrapped in a cloth she'd mended. His presence had become like the trees around them, constant, unassuming, quietly strong. There was never a question in his eyes, never a flinch at her changing shape. She began to understand that it wasn't disinterest. It was reverence. He built things in silence. One afternoon, she found a cradle leaning against the wall, just outside the cabin, carved from pine, smoothed and shaped by patient hands. Birds along the arch, small trees along the base. He hadn't said it was for her, and she didn't ask. She only placed her palm on the curve of the wood and held it there until her breath slowed. Ben came more often now, bringing treasures he'd found along creek beds and near the train tracks, buttons, bits of glass, a broken pocket watch. Clara taught him how to sew patches, how to braid string, how to make a biscuit from almost nothing. He talked as he worked, filling the silence Elias left behind. He asked questions she didn't mind answering. Sometimes, he pressed his ear against her belly and said he could hear the baby dreaming. "You think it's a girl?" he asked one morning, squinting into the garden. "I think it's someone who will need to be brave," Clara replied. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. The garden took shape slowly. Shoots appeared like shy fingers testing the light. A row of green beans. Something that might be carrots. Flowers whose names she'd forgotten but remembered how to care for. It was not much, not yet, but it was hers. A small promise in the dirt. Elias brought her a basket one evening, woven with care, filled with beeswax, herbs, and a book. He placed it beside her, without a word. She turned the book over in her hands. The cover was worn, the corners softened by time. Inside, pages filled with pressed leaves and handwritten notes. "It was my wife's," he said, gaze steady. "She kept track of the wild plants here. What healed? What didn't?" Clara looked up at him. "Thank you. She would have liked you." He left then, his footsteps muffled by moss and dusk. Later that night, Clara opened the book again, pressing her hand into the pages, like touching someone else's life. She read by candlelight, her baby shifting inside her as if listening too. There were notes in a looping hand, descriptions of flowers, remedies for burns, sketches of leaves. And at the back, a single line written in darker ink. "Kindness does not grow unless you plant it where it's needed most." The next morning, Clara found Elias sanding the rocker he'd been working on for weeks. She sat beside him without speaking, the garden behind her, the weight of spring in her bones. She reached for a carving knife, picked up a spare block of wood, and began to shape something, slow, imperfect, but steady. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with the hum of bees, the creak of trees, the shared rhythm of two people who understood how to carry quiet things. But the peace, as gentle as it was, did not keep the world away. Emery Tate rode back into town the way a thunderstorm does, not with warning, but with weight. Clara saw him first from the porch, his figure stiff in the saddle, his coat dusty with trail miles. He tied his horse outside the saloon, glanced once toward the church, then toward the widow's house, then toward Elias's land. She turned her face before he could meet her eyes. Later, at the general store, folks spoke in whispers. Emery was asking questions. About the baby. About her. About the man who'd taken her in. The words legal rights floated through the dry air like smoke. Elias said nothing when she told him. He didn't flinch, didn't scowl. Just set his cup down and said, "Let him ask. You don't understand what men like him believe they're owed. I understand enough." That night, she didn't sleep. She watched the cradle. The baby kicked against her ribs, restless, as if sensing the tension curled in her breath. By morning, Emery was standing at the edge of the path that led to Elias's porch. His face was sharp with sunburn and pride. "That child's mine," he said, "by law if not by choice." Elias stepped out slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. "You left her. That's all I need to know. I made a mistake. Don't mean I don't have a claim. This ain't cattle. It's blood." Elias's voice did not rise. "Blood don't make a father. Staying does." Clara stepped between them, her palms open. "You didn't want us, Emery. Not when it counted." "I didn't know," he muttered. "You knew enough. Enough to leave me standing alone." The sheriff came later, summoned by one of the neighbors. Elias didn't resist. He only stood beside Clara, tall and calm, as she told the truth to the man who carried the badge. Her voice did not shake. Her hands didn't hide. She spoke with the quiet strength of someone who had buried shame like seed and watched something softer rise in its place. The sheriff nodded, said the law didn't look kindly on men abandoning contracts and women, said Emery ought to ride on and leave well enough alone. The town watched it happen, and no one raised a word in protest. That night, Clara returned to the cradle and wept, not from fear, but release. The garden outside had bloomed in her absence, a dozen new shoots pushing toward the sun. She turned to Elias. "Why did you stay quiet?" "Because sometimes talking makes a wound worse." She reached for his hand. It was rough, warm, steady. "You're not the man I expected," she said, "and you're not the woman I thought I was building a cradle for." They sat in silence again, the kind that grows between two people who have held space for each other's pain and planted something else in its place. Tomorrow would come, but tonight there was this, a garden blooming outside, a cradle beside the fire, and the quiet knowledge that not all love begins with thunder. Some of it begins with listening. The sky cracked open with a storm just past midnight, rain falling like spilled nails, cold and quick and insistent. Thunder rolled low across the hills, shaking the porch beams, rattling loose the scent of pine. In the cradle beside the hearth, Clara's folded shawl waited for a baby not yet born, and across the cabin, Elias stirred from his cot, already pulling on his boots before she could call out. She was standing, gripping the table's edge, breath caught in her throat, pain circling low in her back, like a tightening loop. Her face was damp, though not from the rain. "It's starting," she whispered. Elias nodded once. No panic, no questions, just movement. He gathered water, lit the lanterns, stacked the fire. Then he saddled the mule and sent Ben flying to the widow's house through the storm with a message. "It's time." The hours that followed were slow and heavy and ancient. Widow Hattie arrived with sleeves rolled up and voice firm, her hands already soaked to the wrists in warm water. She moved with the sharpness of someone who'd done this before, more times than she could count, and once for herself. Elias stayed outside. He built a second fire, this one under the porch awning, rain spitting at his shoulders. He chopped what he didn't need and whispered things to the sky that had no shape. Every cry from the cabin pulled at him like wire. But he didn't go in. He knew some things couldn't be fixed with tools. Inside, Clara clung to the edge of the bed, face buried in her arm, the world narrowing to breath and ache and the deep, molten strength of a woman becoming something more. "She's stubborn," Hattie muttered, "just like her mama." Clara gasped. "Good." The pain took her apart, piece by piece, then stitched her together in someone else's shape. She screamed once, raw, low, not for fear, but for release. And when the quiet came, it was so sudden it made the room tilt. A cry pierced the storm. "Hi, wet alive." Hattie wrapped the baby in flannel and placed her on Clara's chest. Tiny fingers, wet curls, lungs full of the wild world already. Clara didn't cry. She just held the child and exhaled, the kind of breath that takes a year to gather. They didn't speak. There were no words sacred enough for that moment. A few minutes later, Elias stepped inside, hat in his hands, hair slick with rain. He stood at the threshold like a man approaching something holy. Clara turned, eyes rimmed red, skin pale but glowing from some other light. She tilted the bundle gently, revealing the child nestled against her. "She's here," Clara said. Elias didn't answer. He just looked. Hattie cleared her throat, wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll let the two of you be." She passed Elias on her way out and murmured something only he heard. "Some things you carve with your hands, some with your heart. You done both now." When the door shut behind her, the storm had softened. Rain still whispered, but the thunder had wandered off toward other hills. Elias stepped closer. The fire cast amber over the cradle. He looked down at the baby, his brow tight with something deeper than worry. "She's small," he said. "She's strong," Clara replied. He knelt then, one hand braced on his knee, the other hovering just above the edge of the blanket. He didn't touch the child. Not yet. He only watched her chest rise and fall, slow and sure. His eyes shimmered like river stones under deep water. "I didn't expect any of this," Clara whispered. "I came here with nothing but a letter and a lie." Elias finally looked at her. "And now?" She took his hand, the one still shaking slightly, and placed it gently against the baby's back. Now I know what true feels like. He closed his eyes. His fingers curled slightly, as if memorizing the weight of her. I built that cradle for someone I'd never met, he said. Didn't know why. You did, Clara murmured. You just didn't know her name yet. They sat like that for a long time, Clara resting, Elias watching, the child breathing in that quiet between people who had nothing left to hide. In the days that followed, the world softened around them. The garden bloomed in wild color, vegetables nudging up beside flowers Clara hadn't planted. Bees swirled lazily around the hives, and Ben carved a wooden rattle with Elias's tools, painting it with leftover dye and gifting it like a treasure to the child he already called sister. No one in town asked questions anymore. Whatever had happened between Clara and Emery was spoken of in low tones that never reached the porch of Elias's cabin. Some folks brought bread. Others left baby clothes folded with care. There was something about a man who stayed, who chose fatherhood not out of obligation, but out of quiet conviction. One morning, Elias placed a rocking chair beside the fire. He hadn't built it for show. It was sturdy, wide enough for two, rounded at the back where a woman could lean her head against a shoulder. Clara sat down with the baby nestled close and rocked gently, the creak a lullaby all its own. Elias handed her a cup of tea, warm and sweet with honey. I want to name her Rose, Clara said softly, not because she's delicate, but because she'll grow through anything. He nodded, his fingers brushing the crown of the child's head. She already has. Spring leaned toward summer, and with it came birdsong and berry pies and nights where the wind spoke only in lullabies. The cabin, once filled with silence, now breathed with small sounds, baby coos, soft laughter, the sound of wood being shaped into toys and spoons. One evening, as the sun dripped low over the hills, Clara stood by the garden, the baby bundled in her arms, Elias beside her with hands resting easy at his sides. You carved a life here, she said, watching the rows of vegetables sway in the breeze. Long before I arrived. I carved wood, he replied. You carved the rest. She leaned her head against him, the baby sighing in her sleep. You didn't save us, Elias. I wasn't trying to. She smiled. That's how I knew you were the one who could. They stood in the golden hush, the horizon wide before them. No ceremony, no need, just the quiet, rooted knowledge that something sacred had been made between them. Not fast, not loud, but true. Not all fathers are chosen by blood. Some are chosen by steadiness, by rocking chairs and carved cradles and the sound of rain at midnight. Some are made not in the moment a child is born, but in all the moments before, when love is still silent, still forming, still waiting. And sometimes, love isn't something that arrives. It's something that's carved, slow, rough, and real, from stone. Love doesn't always ride in with a badge or a gun. Sometimes, it carves itself slow and true. If you felt it too, hit subscribe and ride with us again through stories that remember the forgotten hearts of the West.